On July 20th, 1889, 6 men hanged a 28-year-old woman named Ella Watson from a pine tree near the Sweetwater River in Wyoming Territory. They did not hide what they had done. One of them, Tom's son, told the sheriff, who arrived 3 days later, exactly what had happened and said he felt it was justified. The 6 men were arrested, charged, and brought before a grand jury. Every witness who was going to testify against them died or disappeared before the hearing. One witness died of poison hours before he was scheduled to testify. Another vanished and was never found. A third left Wyoming entirely and was never summoned back. By the time the case came before the grand jury, there was no one left to testify. The charges were dropped. The following year, 2 of the men who had lynched Ella Watson were elected to the executive committee of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. A third was elected to the legislature. Albert Bothwell, the man who had organized the lynching, eventually acquired both homesteads, Ella's and her partner, Jim Averill's. That the couple had been killed for refusing to give up. He moved his own house onto Ella's land. He retired to Los Angeles. He died in 1928. Nobody ever went to trial. This is not the part of the story that gets told when people mention Cattle Kate. The part that gets told is the nickname, the lurid accounts that ran in Wyoming and Chicago and New York newspapers the day after the lynching, painting Ella Watson as a prostitute who accepted stolen cattle in exchange for her favors, as a violent woman known for knocking men down with her fists and horsewhipping them, as an outlaw and rustler whose death was, in the words of the Cheyenne Daily Leader's editor, a lawless but justifiable deed. That version of the story was written by men who had just killed her, fed to editors who were in the pocket of the same cattle association that had organized the killing, and published before anyone outside a small Wyoming valley had any opportunity to know what had actually happened. The name Cattle Kate was not Ella Watson's name. It was the name of a different woman, Kate Maxwell, a performer and saloon operator in a town called Bessemer, 10 miles away, who had actually been involved in some of the behavior the newspapers attributed to Ella. The Cheyenne papers, publishing their accounts within days of the lynching, confused the 2 women, applied one's notoriety to the other, and created the legend that has been attached to Ella Watson's name ever since. Ella Watson was neither a prostitute nor a cattle rustler. The evidence for both conclusions comes from the same source. The land records, the brand applications, the homestead filings, and the court documents that survived the fire that destroyed most of the Watson-Averill legal record. George Huffsmith, a composer who spent 20 years researching Watson's life for an opera he wrote about the lynching, was the first researcher to examine these documents systematically. His 1993 book, The Wyoming Lynching of Cattle Kate, documented the gap between the newspaper version and the documented reality with a thoroughness that permanently changed how historians understand the case. Ellen Liddy Watson was born on July 2, 1860, in Ontario, Canada. Her family moved to Kansas when she was a teenager, and she married at 18. A neighbor named William Pickle, who drank too much and became violent. After one particularly severe beating, she left him and returned to her family. She filed for divorce, which was itself a legally and socially complicated act for a woman in the 1880s. She worked as a cook in Nebraska and Wyoming, moving through the frontier economy available to a woman alone. Domestic service, hotel kitchens, the kind of respectable but poorly compensated labor that offered survival without security. She arrived in the Sweetwater Valley of Wyoming Territory around 1886 and met James Averill, who was running a store and post office on the Sweetwater River, and also serving as a notary public and justice of the peace. He was 10 years older than her, educated, and had an unusually sophisticated understanding of land law for someone operating a frontier trading post. The 2 filed for a marriage license in Landa, Wyoming, though whether they ever formally married is unclear. Documents suggest they may have married privately and not registered it, possibly because a married couple was entitled to only one homestead claim under federal law. while two single people could file two separate adjacent claims, effectively doubling their combined land. In the spring of 1888, Ella filed her official homestead claim with the land office in Cheyenne, 160 acres along Horse Creek in the Sweetwater Valley. This land had water, a creek that fed irrigation for the hay meadows that sustained cattle through Wyoming winters. And it sat on territory that Albert Bothwell, the wealthiest rancher in the county, had been using as open range, putting up barbed wire fencing around land he did not own and had no legal right to fence. Bothwell offered to buy Ella out. She refused. She told him she wanted the land more than the money. He did not take the refusal well. He had cowboys harass the couple. He pinned skull and crossbones symbols to their doors. He pushed Averil's fence lines. And when none of this persuaded Ella to sell, he waited for a pretext. The pretext came in December 1888 and the following months. Ella purchased cattle from a drover who was moving a herd through the region, 28 animals that were footsore and exhausted from the trail, bought cheaply because their condition made them difficult to sell at full market price. She branded them with a mark she had purchased from a neighboring rancher, after her own brand applications were twice rejected by committees that Bothwell's allies controlled. In the summer of 1889, Bothwell told other ranchers that Ella had been rustling cattle and branding animals that belonged to them. The accusation was convenient, unprovable in the moment, and activated a frontier code that treated cattle rustling as justification for immediate violent response. 5 other cattlemen agreed to join him. They rode to Ella's homestead on the morning of July 20th. Subscribe to Lawless Frontier right now, because what happened at that homestead and what Frank Buchanan saw when he rode up over the rocks and looked down at the scene was documented by at least one eyewitness who survived long enough to give a statement to the sheriff before he too disappeared. Frank Buchanan was a ranch hand who had ridden out to see what the commotion was about. What he found was Ella Watson and Jim Averil, with ropes around their necks, being pushed off rocks into the gulch below. Buchanan drew his weapon and fired. The cattleman fired back. In the confusion, Ella and Averil fell. The ropes had been tied too close together on the same tree limb. According to the witness account that survived before Buchanan himself disappeared, they grappled with each other as they died, still in contact with one another. Buchanan rode to find the sheriff. The sheriff arrived 3 days later. Ella Watson and Jim Averil's bodies were still hanging from the tree. The next day, the Cheyenne newspapers published their accounts. The accounts identified Ella Watson as Cattle Kate Maxwell, the woman from Bessemer, whose reputation for violence and criminal behavior was already established in the regional press. They described her as a prostitute who ran a hog ranch and accepted stolen cattle as payment. They described Averil as her pimp and partner in crime. They quoted sources that did not exist or could not be identified. They provided justification for a killing that had already happened and could not be undone. The man who wrote the primary account in the Cheyenne Daily Leader, editor Ed Towse, described the lynching as a lawless but justifiable deed and warned that more hangings would follow unless there was less thieving. This was not journalism. It was organized defamation of 2 murdered people, executed within 24 hours of their deaths, designed to prevent anyone from asking too many questions about who had been killed, why, and by whom. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, that organized and enabled the cover-up of the Watson-Averil lynching, was one of the most powerful private organizations in the American West in the 1880s. And understanding its power helps explain why the legal system failed so completely to produce any accountability. The association controlled access to the cattle market, determined which brands were legitimate, and had direct influence over territorial politics through its members' wealth and organization. It employed range detectives, private law enforcement agents who operated outside the legal system, to identify and deal with rustlers according to a frontier code that the association had constructed and enforced on its own terms. The cattle barons who dominated the association had built their fortunes on the open range system, vast herds grazing on federal public land without payment, sustained by the labor of the helot population of homesteaders and small operators who could not effectively challenge their dominance. When homestead law began bringing settlers to the ranges that the cattle barons had been using as their own property, the structural conflict between legal homestead rights and informal cattle baron control created exactly the conditions that produced the Watson-Averill lynching. Albert Bothwell's specific problem with Ella Watson was not primarily the cattle she had purchased and branded. It was the water. Her homestead claim on Horse Creek controlled the irrigation that supported the hay meadows that fed Bothwell's cattle through winter. Without that water access, his ranch operation in that section of the valley was significantly more difficult. He had fenced over 60 miles of land he did not own, operating under the informal understanding that the range was his to control. Ella Watson's legal homestead filing turned that informal understanding into a legal confrontation. He was not certain he could win through legitimate means. The grand jury that was convened to hear the case against the 6 lynchers included 16 members, 7 of whom were cattlemen. This is documented in the court records that survived. By the time the hearing convened, the witnesses were gone. 1 died of poison, 1 vanished, 1 left the territory. The case was dropped. The specific mechanics of how the newspaper defamation campaign worked in July 1889 deserve more attention than the story usually receives.
Because it represents one of the clearest documented examples in frontier history of coordinated media manipulation in service of covering up a crime. The Cheyenne Daily Leader published its account the day after the lynching. The account identified Ella Watson not as Ella Watson but as Cattle Kate Maxwell, a different woman.
It attributed to her a series of violent acts, knocking men down with her fists, horsewhipping a man, shooting at people, that appear to have been drawn from newspaper accounts of the actual Kate Maxwell published in the years before the lynching. The account provided no named sources that could be verified. Its description of the motive for the lynching emphasized cattle rustling rather than the land dispute that the actual participants, including Tom's son, when he spoke to the sheriff, described as the real context. Editor Ed Taus, who wrote the primary account, was not acting independently. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association had consistent access to and influence over the Cheyenne papers, whose advertising revenue and social connections were tied to the cattle economy. The description of the lynching as lawless but justifiable was not journalism's neutral observation of an event. It was advocacy for the position that the men who had just committed a murder should not be prosecuted for it. The account then circulated nationally. Papers in Denver, Omaha, Chicago, and New York picked it up and republished it, adding their own embellishments. By the time the story had run in the national press, Ella Watson had been convicted in print of crimes no one had documented her committing, under a name that was not hers, in a version of events controlled entirely by the people who had killed her. The newspaper version became the history version. For nearly a century after the lynching, Ella Watson was known primarily through the Cattle Kate mythology, the prostitute and rustler who got what she deserved.
The 1953 film The Redhead from Wyoming was loosely based on the myth. The 1980 film Heaven's Gate, one of the most expensive productions in Hollywood history at the time, depicted characters based on Watson and Averill without meaningfully correcting the mythology. The Johnson County War that followed the Watson-Averill lynching 2 years later is the event that most American history treatments of this period focus on, partly because it involved a larger and more dramatic confrontation. In April 1892, the Wyoming Stock Growers Association organized an invasion of Johnson County in northern Wyoming by approximately 50 cattlemen and hired Texas gunmen intended to kill a list of men they had identified as rustlers and enemies. The invasion was eventually stopped when local residents organized and trapped the invaders in a ranch, and the U.S. cavalry had to ride in to rescue the cattlemen from the people they had come to kill. Historian Helena Huntington Smith, who wrote the definitive account of the Johnson County War in 1966, argued directly that the Watson-Averill lynching
enabled the later invasion. That the successful cover-up of the 1889 murders, the disappeared witnesses, the stacked grand jury, the newspaper defamation that had prevented accountability, had demonstrated to the Wyoming cattle barons that they could commit violence against homesteaders without legal consequence. The Johnson County invasion was organized by men who had good reason to believe, based on the 1889 precedent, that the legal system would not effectively pursue them. They were correct in their calculation about how far they could go. They were wrong about the scale of local resistance they would face. But the pattern that the Watson-Averill cover-up had established, violence by the powerful, defamation of the victims, newspaper coordination, witness elimination, was the template they were working from. It was not a historian who finally broke the story open. It was a composer. George Huffsmith had started researching the Watson-Averill case in the 1970s for an opera he was writing about the lynching. He contacted Watson's surviving family members. He went to Wyoming archives. He examined land records, brand applications, homestead filings, and the fragmentary court documents that existed. What he found was that the documented record of Ella Watson's life, her homestead filings, her brand applications, her marriage license application, a political petition she had signed, her cattle purchase receipts, described a woman who was building something specific and legal on the Wyoming frontier, not a criminal enterprise. He published his research in 1993 in a book titled The Wyoming Lynching of Cattle Kate. It is the first serious attempt to reconstruct the case from documented evidence rather than newspaper accounts. It is in every Wyoming library. It effectively established that the Cattle Kate mythology was a coordinated fabrication produced by the men who had organized the killing, fed through newspapers that were editorially aligned with the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, and accepted as fact for a century because there was no one left to contest it. Albert Bothwell got the land. The witnesses died or disappeared. The jury was stacked. The newspapers printed the story the killers wanted. And the woman who refused to sell her homestead to a wealthy rancher who wanted her water rights was remembered for 100 years as a prostitute and cattle rustler. She was 28 years old when they hanged her. She had filed her homestead claim less than 2 years earlier. She had bought her cattle with money she had saved working as a cook. The frontier code that Bothwell invoked, the rancher's right to deal directly with rustlers without waiting for courts that might not convict, was not law. It was the self-serving assertion of men wealthy enough to make their version of events stick, backed by newspapers that depended on cattle association advertising, and processed through a grand jury that included 7 members with direct financial interests in never letting the case come to trial. This is the real story of Cattle Kate, not the bar-fighting, cattle-rustling, man-horse-whipping legend that the Cheyenne papers invented in July 1889, but a homesteader who filed a legal claim, built a cabin, bought cattle with receipts she kept at the bank in Rawlins, refused to sell to the man who wanted her water, and died for it. If you want the real history behind the Old West legends, subscribe to Lawless Frontier, because next week we go somewhere even darker.